How the Big Pen Changed the World. Story of the pen. Today, the modern pen that we use today is commonly used everywhere. You probably know what I'm talking about. But we're not always like this. In understanding the history of the pen, we have to go back to some of the first pens, and how they're used. 1778. Quills are quite very messy and they constantly have to dip in ink, so they aren't very effective and sort of an art. So most people aren't really interested. By now, only around 20% of the world's actually educated, so that's not very good. What happens is that a new pen arises, the fountain pen. It's quite ingenious storing ink within itself, but it can't control the flow of ink. And sometimes it's really scratchy, but then it just blots ink all over the paper. And that's it really is a bit of a disaster. And other people come in. I don't know, an American scientist named in Frederick Biro invents a system that uses a ball to dispense it. What Biro did was he used very just the same system as a fountain pen, but put the ball on the tip instead of an exposed nib, which would in theory mean that they could make lines much clearer without the ink level changing. It was a good tactic, but at the same time, it was a little too rough, and thus it was too rough to use on paper, which was of course needed to be used, and this pen was not really very successful. However, other scientists came up with a system that worked quite well and was pretty much a very good pen, but a big issue arises: the size of the ball. You couldn't really make two identical pens this early on because the balls would always be different sizes. So if the ball was too big, the ink would be scratchy, the ball wouldn't move, and so it would tear the paper. But if it was too loose, the ball may fall out, or the ink would just leak all over the place. So, his pen was never marketed. However, later on, a French scientist named Biro, and his name is named BIC. But then in 1930, Manuel Fernando and BIC invented a system that could, in theory, work. He mainly using Biro's system to use it. So what he essentially did was, pretty much replace most of the parts, but the basic idea remained, using a ball to dispense it. He switched watchmaking machine to make everything accurate down to 0.8 millimeters. And they were also such a good way that the balls, when put in writing, because of their own weight, they would push back, allowing it to write, and thus allow the ink to roll over. But when not writing, their own gravity caused the ball to fall back down, thus making a seal so that no ink would fall out. Instead of using metal for the body, he used plastic, which allowed it to be able to see the ink level at all times. Instead of filling the entire body with ink, which was a bit unsafe because a small leak could result in ink spilling everywhere, he put a tube in the middle, which would be filled with ink instead, and the rest was sent by air. The small hole inside the pen so that as the ink level lowered, it won't create a vacuum, and air could simply pass through. The pen itself was shaped hexagonal like a pencil so that it wouldn't roll off the surface, The back of the pen is made out of polystyrene, so that it wouldn't fall, it wouldn't crack. All this eventually built up on itself, and thus we created the big pen, the BIC. However, Biz realized how English people pronounce the country spelled its name, which sounded like bitch, which is of course slang. So what he instead did was remove the H, and the BIC name was born. And today, BIC is over 120 billion in pens per year, which on its own is mind blowing. For time, and then this is the literacy rate rose around 90%, with the remaining being like Native Africans or Native Asians or Aboriginals or Native Americans. Those are the only people who were not literate. But 90% of the world was able to read and write thanks to the BIC pen. And thus, the BIC pen is one of the most useful pens in history. It is the most modern pen today. That is the story of the BIC pen. Thank you for watching. See you next time.